Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Luke Baumgartner, and I'm a research fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. I'm joined today by Lois Shearing to discuss her new book, Pink Pilled Women and the Far Right. Lois is a freelance journalist who's writing on sex, sexuality, gender, relationship, digital culture, and politics, has appeared in multiple reputable outlets such as The Cosmopolitan, The Independent, and others. So, Lois, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here chatting with you.
Yes, as we all are. So, as I do with all of our panelists who join us for book talks, I like to give them the chance to kind of engage with the audience and give a little bit about you, who you are, and what sort of inspired you to undertake your book writing journey, and specifically this one.
Yeah, so I am primarily a journalist and an author. I have two other books out. Before this one I just wrote, and the other one I co-edited with a friend of mine. It's an anthology. Both of those focus on sexuality and queerness. So this book was a slight deviation from the sort of career path I was setting up for myself. I also write a lot about sex and sexuality as a journalist. But I was also covering a lot of digital culture as well. And I think there's a really big overlap between discussions about sexuality and discussions about digital culture. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. Um, but this book had kind of been kind of something that had been following me through a lot of my life in a way. I grew up very rurally in the UK and I spent a lot of time on the internet. And I kind of was in my adolescence whilst, the internet and social media was coming into its adolescence. And so it was such a big part of my life. And kind of quite young as a teenager, I stumbled on some manosphere blogs pretty accidentally, but I got quite like not sucked into it as in I was like interested in it or it resonated with me, but sucked into it more in that it was like this scab that I couldn't stop picking at. So that was probably around like 2014, 2013, maybe. And so I was kind of keeping tabs on these communities just in the background of my life for quite a while. And I sort of watched, as many of us did, as they kind of changed from these communities of mostly like focusing on pickup artistry or men's rights activism and kind of blossomed into like Gamergate. And then obviously several of the actors from that ended up playing quite a big part in like the alt right. So I had a pretty good background knowledge on that process, but I was more and more noticing content sort of created by and on the surface directed at women. And I was just really fascinated about why we were looking less at this. I kind of understand better now about like the male supremacy side of things, but I wanted to understand what that so-called pipeline looks like for young women because I was seeing it just more and more. I was seeing more young women kind of share these kind of worrying ideas. And there didn't really seem to be a conversation about it happening in the same way there was about, young men on discords and gaming websites and 4chan and things like that. So the book actually started life as a podcast that I made during lockdown. And then I just wanted to dig deeper into it and keep investigating. And that's how Pink Pilled was born.
Excellent, good to hear. So I kind of wanted to start by, sort of setting the landscape that you kind of briefly touched on. During that time of 2013, 14, 15, 16-ish was when we saw the rise of, the alt-right. And a lot of that really blossomed out of Gamergate and the Manosphere. So as with, a lot of talks that we give, we try and give the audience, a basic background on some of these terms that we're throwing around. And so for those in our audience that might not know what some of these things are, um, how would you sort of describe, the Manosphere and Gamergate, and how do those events or movements sort of relate to what we're talking about today, which is primarily women's involvement in the far right groups and movements?
For sure, yeah. So the manosphere, there's a lot of discussion about it right now. I don't know if this is on American Netflix as well, but this great show in the UK just came out called Adolescence, which explores the manosphere really, really well. So it's very topical here in the UK at the moment. But the manosphere is this kind of networked misogyny, basically. So you could think of different websites as like different constellations that are all connected through the threads of male supremacism. So you have like men's rights activists are a big group in the manosphere. These are men who they purport to be concerned with the rights of men, as the name suggests, but actually, what they focus a lot on is kind of anti feminism and pushing back against feminist progress. Um, then you have kind of the pickup artists, or another kind of section of the manosphere, which again, they self describe themselves as kind of giving dating tips to young men, but actually, what it often is kind of instructions on coercion and sexual violence. Um, and then you have incels, which again, a lot of conversation happening about incels right now, which is short for involuntary celibate, for anyone who doesn't know. These are men who are kind of, there's a lot of aggrieved entitlement at this idea that they deserve more access to women and to women's sexuality and bodies than they're being granted. And that kind of festers into a real sort of violence and misogyny. It's I would say incels are possibly the most dangerous community within the manosphere. I think certainly they have the highest record for like violence,
Hmm.
sort of incel motivated violence. Um, and so Gamergate is sort of a part of the manosphere, but also kind of tangential to it. So the manosphere, sorry, so Gamergate was this smear campaign against an independent games journalist, Zoe Quinn, kind of initiated by her ex-partner. Um, Nowadays, we might call it like cyber stalking or cyber harassment, but this happened, like 10 years ago. We didn't really have the language for it then, but it kind of snowballed into this real like anti-feminist backlash, particularly sort of directed at female journalists and lots of like prominent women in the gaming community. And Steve Bannon, who was, I think, editor in chief of Breitbart at the time, and then, of
Hmm.
course, went on to be a kind of special advisor in Trump's first administration. He sort of said that he used Gamergate as almost like a test run for culture wars. So, how can we kind of spread these really diversive ideas about like gender or sexuality or whatever. So that's kind of a very brief overview of the manosphere and its links to the alt-right. The alt-right was a kind of subsection of the far right. Far right is quite a big term. I'm obviously UK based, if it's not obvious from my accent, but we have like our own sort of little mini branches of the far right here. We have like civic nationalism and white nationalism and counter jihad. Whereas in the US, you guys have some sort of different movements like Identity Europa and sort of the Proud Boys and things like that. The alt right was a far right ideology that is still knocking around a little bit today, but kind of had its height between, I would say, like the mid 2010s and maybe like 2020 when Trump was kind of leaving office for the first time. So, um, but there was a lot of women involved in the alt right more than people think, I believe. Um, and a lot of women, I was quite surprised to learn in the process of this book, kind of entered the alt right or the far right here in the UK, kind of through a lot of manosphere websites. Um, Kind of anti feminism was a big radicalizer for a lot of the men in the alt right, and something that surprised me a lot in the book was learning that like anti-feminism was a really big radicalizer and a really big draw for a lot of women in that movement as well. That's kind of one of the main links between like the manosphere and women in the far right.
Hmm. So with that, how do you think some of this, more divisive gender-based content or anti-feminist content that comes out of these predominantly male spaces of the manosphere and the alt-right, what sort of, rhetorical devices or rhetoric do they use to appeal to women to eventually get them to sort of either adopt their worldview or join their ranks in an organization?
Yeah, I think there's a few key ones. I think a mistake that I made when I approached this book was I wanted to investigate these women because I was seeing them joining these movements, and I couldn't understand why they would join movements that to me felt so against their best interests. But the step I hadn't taken back when I started the investigating that I ended up taking throughout the book was asking myself, well, what do these women think their best interests are?
Hmm.
I know what I think their best interests are, but it turns out they have a very different view to me on their best interests. And so, one of the kind of main, I think, discursive tools that they're using is to try and convince these women, or to convince all women, that their best interests um, are ones that really align with a kind of traditional idea of femininity and traditional gender roles. So, things like being submissive, things like your husband being your leader and the kind of ruler of your household. And then that comes with a lot of kind of restrictions on bodily autonomy. So things like abortion restrictions, birth control restrictions, marriage restrictions. And so I think we're seeing this a lot with trad wife content at the moment. This idea that women are happier in their more natural state, and their more natural state is one of being in the home and being submissive and taking care of children. Um, a really powerful sort of tool that I'm seeing them use is this false dichotomy of the idea that like liberal feminism and mainstream feminism, of which I have a lot of criticisms of, is that liberal feminism has set you up for this life of going out into the world doing paid productive labor and then coming home and still having to do unpaid reproductive labor. Or you can kind of step back into this more traditional role where you don't have to go out and do productive paid labor. You can just do the cooking and cleaning and looking after children, and have a much more relaxed life. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have seen the like soft life trend that's happening on social media right now. But obviously, this is a false dichotomy, and this isn't how it plays out for the women in these communities. A really great researcher called Kat Poldy refers to this as the promise of leisure time, the
Hmm.
promise that by joining these communities and adhering to these gender roles, you will have, more time to rest. We're also burnt out right now. So that was a really powerful kind of anti-feminist um, kind of discussion that I saw a lot of. In the UK and Europe, femo-nationalism was a really big one. So this idea that we need to secure our borders against mostly, immigrants coming in from Muslim countries. Excuse me, was kind of a really big talking point, particularly given the context of the UK far right having grown out of like what's called the counter jihad movement. Um, and for us in the UK, another really big discussion point, and for America too, I would say at this point, was of course like transphobia, particularly trans misogyny, but also some really big kind of entry points I saw for women were like natural birthing communities, um, and kind of anti medical establishment in the sort of what's I think has been nicknamed by a lot of people in the media as the wellness to alt-right pipeline. I don't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
what that term is, but that was a really big one coming in through these like wellnessy kind of wooey like alternative medicine pathways. So they were some of the really sort of big like overview of the discussion points that I was seeing.
yeah. And you kind of start off the book by talking about, this specific sort of uh, two, Instagram influencers who talk about this sort of, trad or trad wife or soft life sort of aesthetic or chic. Um, but you kind of peel back the layers of the onion to reveal something that's a little more serious and a little more extreme at, behind the scenes. That's not available for their Instagram audiences to see, where they can share much more far right or extreme ideology on other platforms. So can you talk a little bit about how you sort of saw that with those two, and you saw this trend with other influencers in that space as well?
Yeah, for sure. Also, please excuse me kind of coughing and drinking tea. I have a bit of a sore throat today. Um, yeah, this is called kind of like forward and backward facing media. Um, so forward or front facing media would be, um, like discussions about baking bread or discussion if we're talking about trad wives or discussions about gender roles or dating, stuff that's quite innocuous on the surface that if you came across it on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, you might watch it and maybe think, maybe this feels a little weird, or you might watch it and think, yeah, that's really interesting. But it doesn't kind of strike a chord of maybe having like an ideological undertone to it.
Hmm.
And this is kind of a way that these influencers build a following on kind of high level social media accounts. And what I mean by that is like very mainstream social media like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Um, and then kind of through building that community, followers are brought into kind of the backwards facing media, or what's sometimes known as more like dark socials. So
Yeah.
they might be like closed Telegram groups, forums, Facebook groups, even like closed Facebook groups, and groups that don't have a kind of public facing presence to them where their influencer and their communities can kind of discuss maybe slightly more like ideological or extremist ideas or extreme ideas. Um, back when the internet was in like internet 2.0, that might also include like blogs and things like that were a little
Hmm.
harder to find.
Or Tumblr or something like
Or
that.
Tumblrs for sure. So that was kind of the experience that I had with those two influencers that I used as an example was seeing one of their forward facing videos, following it back to their kind of their blog and then some of their like more community groups and seeing the ways in which they were sharing some slightly more like extreme ideas. And that was actually a very similar process to how I ended up following a lot of manosphere blogs in that I'd kind of seen
Mm.
forward facing media and followed it back to the backward facing media. So that broadly is kind of what we talk about when we're talking about the so-called like radicalization pipeline is that
Yeah.
pipeline starting at this top level, less extreme content and following it through via, chat rooms, groups, whatever, into kind of smaller and more extremist and more ideologically driven communities.
Yeah, so I kind of this is a question that I don't have prepared, but I kind of thought of this while you're talking about that. Um, do you think there was some sort of like chicken or the egg sort of situation here with, you know, you said that these women or these trad wife sort of influencers have that front facing and back facing sort of content. Do you think they picked that up from Manosphere, or was that sort of a natural evolution of their own content development?
Yeah, I think the term tradwife, like a lot of terms, has been really broadened from its original meaning.
Yeah.
Um, when I first started writing the book, tradwife was something that was quite specific to the alt-right,
Hmm.
and it kind of referred to women in the alt-right who were promoting this idea that women needed to be kind of help meet, to borrow an evangelical term, needed to be kind of submissive to their husbands and kind of be birthers of the nation is kind of a term you see thrown around a lot. Um, but I think the tradwifery, I think the tradwife trend has really broadened. And so you're seeing these kind of more modern iterations of tradwives like Ballerina Farms and Nara Smith and people like that, where it maybe doesn't have the alt-right kind of roots that
Hmm.
um, that tradwife really meant when I started researching this about 4 or 5 years ago. So I think they were getting it from kind of alt-right manosphere ideas. And interestingly, if you look at the audiences for a lot of those original trad wives, it wasn't other women, it was men.
Hmm.
Um, they would be making this content that was ostensibly about appealing to women and specifically about kind of encouraging women to join the alt-right movement or to adopt alt-right beliefs. But the sort of sleight of hand trick they were playing was that actually this content really appealed to men and was being watched by a lot of men. Um, so kind of in the beginning, it was this strange circle of ideas that sort of started in the manosphere were sort of picked up and recreated by women, but was still like appealing to men. Whereas I think what we've seen in the last couple of years as trad wife influencers have moved onto TikTok more than YouTube is a real broadening of the term, and it's sort of lost some of its alt-right roots in a way. Um, I still think it promotes regressive gender ideas, but I don't think all of it is connected to the alt-right anymore.
Okay. Interesting. Um, so you make a point to, convey to the reader in your book that women have sort of always been involved in these far right groups and movements, and they've done that across time. So traditionally, what have their roles within these groups and movements been, and how has that evolved since, you know, women joined the Klan in the early, 20th century or something along those lines?
I think one of the key roles women have always played in these movements is as propagandists. Um,
Hmm.
and so they've been creating propaganda, but they've also acted kind of as a physical embodiment of propaganda in a way, like using, conventionally attractive women in your imagery, whether your imagery is a poster, if we're talking about kind of, you know, the Third Reich and stuff like that, or in like a digital form, if we're looking more modern at like, digital videos and things that are created. So having like beautiful women in the movement has always been like a useful recruiting tool. Um, but women have then like really taken on that role of creating propaganda and of softening the message of the far right, particularly if we look at kind of benevolent sexism or specifically like white womanhood and the way in which white women are often treated as, inherently like less dangerous and softer and gentler than basically anybody else. Having sort of women um, talk about your ideas or spread your ideas, it feels more approachable and less dangerous than when men are doing it. Um, this is often called like femo washing. So
Oh, okay.
women have been really useful for kind of that tactic. It's quite a big thing if you look at current kind of far right and populist parties in Europe right now. A lot of them have female leaders, and a lot of
Yeah.
them are using this rhetoric of being like wives and mothers um, to make the party politics feel a lot more like soft and homely than when you have figures like, say, Viktor Orban.
Yeah.
Similar ideas, right? It feels a lot more like Viktor Orban's taken this like strong man approach, whereas, say, Giorgio Maloney is taking this real like, I'm just doing this because I'm nurturing Italy. Um, whereas possibly that ideology is maybe not that different.
Yeah. Marine Le Pen is, one example that I think embodies that
Mm-hmm.
very well.
For sure. Especially because, she took on leadership of the party. She's kind of a Nepo baby of the far
A
right.
bit, yeah, yeah.
It was her dad who was a leader beforehand.
Hmm.
Her ideas are not that different to his. Um, but she is seen as having a much like softer and more approachable presence within the party. And look how successful it's been for her, right? Um, and so kind of, yeah, acting as propagandist has been a really important role. But also doing a lot of the reproductive labor.
Hmm.
And by that, I mean both literal reproductive labor of having children in these movements and communities, but also the reproductive labor, as in the like writing and printing brochures, sewing clan robes, organizing meetings, the kind of like invisible soft labor that women are often expected to do, whether it's in like a corporate job or in the home or in like an extremist movement. It's women often picking up this unseen labor. Um, and so they've been doing a lot of that in the movements. I think a really good example of that is kind of, um, women organizing buses to get men or groups of men to certain protests and things like that. Um, I was going to make one third point about the role they played, and I've kind of forgotten it. Oh, ideas ideation. So women
Mm.
also are kind of quite pivotal in shaping these movements in ways that's often sort of forgotten about. So kind of in the UK, a good example of that is that the woman who founded, well, the British Fascisti Party was set up and founded by a woman, and she created a lot of the ideology behind that. Um, so women are often not performing acts of violence. When we talk about like radicalized women, women don't reach the sort of top of the iceberg of radicalization, which is committing terrorism. It's
Hmm.
happened a couple of times, but not as often as, men are committing overwhelmingly the majority of like extremist violence. So when we talk about radicalized women, we're talking about women in these movements who are propelling the movement forward, but maybe not, committing terrorist violence.
Yeah. Um, so let's kind of move on to the beginning stages of, um, involvement in this far right space, specifically for women, because that's the point of this discussion. So during the course of writing this book and doing all the associated, research and interviews, did you find ways in which the radicalization paths differed for women compared to men? And what were some of those differences, if you found them?
Yeah, I think there was a few differences. We've talked already about anti-feminism and how I found it really interesting that anti-feminism was still quite a big kind of draw for women. But I think it took a slightly different it's a slightly different flavor of anti-feminism that was being employed. So for men, it was often very out and out misogyny. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas for women, it was, of course, this more like internalizing of failure. These women saw this kind of idea of this is how to be a woman, and I'm not living up to that, and that's my fault. And like, how can I be a better woman to deserve a better man? Like, weirdly, romance was quite at the heart of a lot of this.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's where I saw a lot of the kind of trad wife stuff stemming from was this idea of like how to best perform womanhood. If we look at kind of the sort of radicalized branch of evangelicalism, there's a lot of stuff about like biblical femininity and
Hmm.
how to be the best kind of woman there. And also the same with, actual pink pill communities, because I use the term pink pill to mean like all women's radicalization, but actually it has this much smaller meaning as well, which are like these small groups of women who are talking about mostly dating strategy. Again, coming back to romance, like it was a real theme. Um, so yeah, again, how to like live up to this idea of womanhood was really like prevalent. And then some of the differences I saw, I think I mentioned earlier, like natural birthing was quite a big community, or quite a big entry point. Obviously, there are some men in the sort of natural birthing community, men who want it for their wives or whatever, but by its very nature, like natural birthing communities, mostly women.
Yeah.
This was often women who'd had like quite traumatic and really horrendous experiences with hospital births, who were looking for alternatives to that, and then ended up in these sort of communities where you start out like, yeah, wanting a better birth, and then you end up questioning vaccines and you end up questioning like
Hmm.
medicine and all that sort of stuff. Um, And actually, when I looked more into sort of these so-called wellness pipelines, what I often found for women was at the heart of what had drawn them into these pipelines was experiencing medical misogyny. So
Hmm.
often they'd had, I have endometriosis, I've had this experience myself. They'd, gone to the doctor and had their pain really dismissed. And so they'd looked for alternatives and they'd ended up in, like natural cycles communities that think birth control give you endometriosis, for example. Um, so that was a really big one. Like I didn't really see for men who I saw questioning, going into these wellness pipelines, it often came from this idea of like how to be as manly as possible.
Yeah.
Whereas for women, it often came with this frustration of like mistreatment within the medical establishment. Um, and then the really big one I saw, of course, because I'm UK based, is transphobia. Um, what we call like gender critical feminists, which has like a real British history to it. um, that was a really big pipeline here. Was women, particularly on a website we have in the UK called Mumsnet,
Hmm.
um, questioning the safety of trans women, and then that causing them to question a lot of their other, you know, liberal beliefs. Um, and also dieting was a big one for women. Women seeking out dieting content and ending up in kind of very gender essentialist communities. So they were some of the like big pipelines that I saw that differed from men, but there was also a lot of overlap. And the overlap was kind of things we might more traditionally think about when we think about the far right. So anti-immigration was of course a big one, racism, anti-blackness, Islamophobia, particularly in like the European context,
Hmm.
and anti-Semitism. They of course were still like very strong pipelines, but I focused on them a little less because whilst a lot of women were drawn into those communities in that way, they were a much more like mixed gendered experience or pipeline,
Yeah.
um, compared to some of the others I just spoke about, which were much more like female focused.
Yeah. And I think with your last comments, you kind of raised two sort of interconnected yet distinct sort of topics or questions. So the first one I want to touch on is something that I see you repeatedly emphasize throughout, all the chapters in the book, is this emphasis on reproduction and, this concept of birthers of a nation. Um, so when it comes to the concept of reproduction, having children, why is this so important for not only, the men that are involved in the movement, but for the women. And how does this idea of being the literal and figurative embodiment of a nation, figure into a woman's role within this movement?
Yeah, I think there's both very like practical considerations and very ideological considerations. And they're very interlinked when it comes to reproduction. Um, when we think about like the far right and kind of modern iterations of the far right, one of the big um, ideological through lines or big like grievances that these communities have is this idea of, the so-called great replacement, which is the idea that white dominated countries will eventually be like outbred essentially by people of color and become like white minority countries. And this is a really big fear for a lot of like the far right movement. Um, and so if you want to stop that happening, the two prong attack you can have is curtailing immigration, and curtailing people of color's ability to procreate and give birth, but also to sort of have more white babies. And this was an actual like challenge that women in the far right would set each other, was to like have as many white babies as possible. Um, and this is still like a really big topic that we're seeing online right now, right? There's some people who are very obsessed with the idea of procreating as many white children as possible. Um, and if you want to have a lot of white babies, you need white women to do that.
Yeah.
Uh, and you can kind of, as I say in the book, you can do it by force or you can do it by convincing white women to be a part of this community. And I think up until now, and still now, like these communities haven't been powerful enough to force women or force white women to give birth. And so you have to convince them that it's in their best interest. Um, but it's also quite a powerful promise, right? This idea that like you are a mother goddess is kind of a term that they use through just your biological reality, your biological abilities. You are going to be like the savior of an entire people. Like, if you're a dissatisfied young person who's maybe facing down like job insecurity or like other frustrations, being told that you can be like a mother warrior just through giving birth, like that's quite a powerful allure for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that was, that's what we see coming up a lot is this idea of like, as you said, white women as the birthers of the nation, but also the mothers of the nation. Not only do you give birth, but you are then this nurturer and caregiver
Mhm.
who reproduces and recreates these ideologies in your children. And you raise your children in a way that, they'll be in these movements, they'll have these ideas. So it's very much about like women as nurturers and women as caregivers. But through caregiving, you are spreading this ideology. Um, excuse me, I'm sorry, my throat is so bad today. Something I found really interesting in the research was how much food played a part in that.
Hmm.
The idea that through your food choices and the food you give your children, you are quite literally like feeding them these ideas, right? You are like feeding them a diet of both literal food and ideology. Um, so yeah, that's kind of why it's quite appealing to white women or to white cisgendered women. This idea that they can be so powerful just by giving birth, and it's why like I was quite shocked to see how many of these women were very anti-abortion and very anti-birth control, but the more I peeled back these layers, the more sense it made to me that, of course, like they're so focused on reproduction, they're so focused on childbirth that, the idea of like a woman who would not want to do that was sounded like very scary and dangerous to them.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because it's also inherently contradictory to the woman-hating misogynist sort of ideology that they fall into. So they're simultaneously propped up as this savior and nurturer of a nation, a race, a people, yet at the same time they're subjected to, oftentimes violent misogyny that's either, physically, verbally, emotionally abusive at the same time and holds them in lower regard compared to their, male comrades within the group or the movement. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this great piece of research. I'm worried I'm going to pronounce her name wrong. Her surname is Lelanaria.
Hmm.
It is written in the book if you guys want to find it. I can't pronounce it very well. But she called this the misogyny paradox.
Uh,
All right, and she said it was like a specific type of misogyny that women in these communities experience, in that the more they try and align themselves with the movement's idea of what a woman should be, the more harassment and violence they experience at the hands of the men in these communities. Because as much as the men in these communities kind of argue for what a woman should be, um, they are male supremacists. They're never going to be content or happy with women. And so, as you said, it was this real like contradiction and a tension that these women talk about a lot within the movement, within their kind of social channels. Was this idea that no matter how much they kind of played up to these gender ideals, they were never able to achieve them.
yeah, it's almost like a uh they keep, trying to strive for this and yet they'll still never achieve this. So I think one of the last questions that I kind of wanted to ask you, that we've kind of briefly touched on in a few different, discussion points, was this confluence of conspirituality, that we've kind of seen evolve, especially, you saw a lot of this within the early QAnon space as well. And you talk about wellness and, food, natural birthing. This is all sort of tangentially related and interconnected to this idea of conspirituality. Um, so how does that play a role in looping these women in? Because, somebody might just be seeking, health advice or wanting to get into yoga or something else, but they get sucked into these sort of crunchy woo-woo conspiracy adjacent areas that eventually lead them down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, conspirituality is fascinating and played a really big role in this. I specifically like didn't touch too much on QAnon in the book because as much as it is like a big radicalizer, it's also very much its own thing. Um,
Yeah.
and I felt like it would be too big to try and tackle QAnon kind of and the far right. There are some fantastic books out there on QAnon for like people who want to go explore them. But I think, yeah, this idea of like alternative wellness is was really powerful. And the conspiracy side of it was really interesting because it wasn't just in wellness that I saw that like I don't know, you could look at like true crime as a radicalizer, right? Women who get really into these like true crime podcasts and true crime stories, and then it comes becomes this conspiracy to them. And I think at the heart of that is this idea of like mistrust and distrust.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about like breakdown in communities and people being so isolated. And the more isolated you are, the less you are like trusting your neighbors, trusting the people around you, and the easier it is for these ideas that there is an us and them, and you don't know who around you is in the them. If you are not like having conversations with the people around you, it's much easier to say like, well, they could all be dangerous. And at the heart of this kind of appeal to women in these communities was this idea of protection from patriarchal violence, which sounds so ironic because we know like how violent and patriarchal these movements are. But what was often kind of being covertly said was like, whoever is out there is more dangerous to you than us. And like, we will protect you from these invading enemies, whether those invading enemies are immigrants coming into the country or like trans women trying to come into your spaces or, whoever the boogeyman of the far right is at that moment. And it changes with whatever's most convenient.
Hmm.
Um, this like promise of protection from this wider conspiracy, this wider threat. And often, like, the ultimate threat employed by the far right is like a sexualized threat against children, right? This is why we're seeing like the term groomer gain so much popularity right now. I am so sorry that I'm
That's okay.
coughing so much. It's cold here in the UK. Um, so yeah, like this conspiracy thinking, and I really feel like social media just blows that up in everyone, whether it's conspiracies about wellness and QAnon, or conspiracies about celebrities, about this idea that like Avril Lavigne has been replaced. Um,
Yeah.
I think like you probably looked into this in your research. I'm sure that if you follow any conspiracy theory down deep enough, it always just gets blamed on Jewish people, um,
Yes. Yeah.
because the ultimate link is the link back to like the blood libel and the idea that
Hmm.
like the original dangerous enemy and enemy to your children is Jewish people. Um, and so I think that's kind of the thread that runs through a lot of like conspiracy thinking, whether again it's QAnon or like lizard people theories or
Hmm.
transvestigations or sex trafficking conspiracies. What it all leads back to is this idea of like the threat of a sexualized other, and the sexualized other originally was Jewish people and still is in a lot of these conspiracies, but now has like broadened to include often Muslims and often queer people. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what I saw being at the heart of a lot of that conspiracy thinking.
Yeah. I think, when you, like you said, if you get down to the roots of any, conspiracy theory, you're only 6 degrees of separation away from blaming something on Jewish people.
A
Um,
good, sorry, I cut you off.
no, that's all right. Go ahead.
I think a good way of like if you're ever worried that someone might have these kind of ideas, you have to just act like a toddler for a bit. And as they're telling you about the conspiracy, just keep asking, like, yeah, but who? Who?
Yeah.
And
Who's they?
eventually,
Yeah, you just
yeah,
have to
who's they?
eventually keep
Eventually they
asking.
will say
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long.
No. Excellent. So with that, I would like to wrap up the formal portion of, this event, and we'll move on to taking questions from our audience. And I see we already have a few rolling in here. Here's one. So this is for all these questions are from our audience. Why was there the perception that women were immune from extremism and espousing radical ideologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to this kind of benevolent sexism. Um, I open the book by asking, like, are women more conservative than men? Because, like, a blind spot I had in my own thinking was I kind of generally believed that women were more progressive. Um, and we've seen that, like, that's not inherently the case. And so I think, like, this idea that women are sort of softer and naturally more, like, open-minded has played a big role. But I also think that, and it feels weird to say this, like, women's contributions to history are erased in general. And that means that we erase the contributions of women who have done incredible things. But it also means that we've erased the contributions of women to a lot of atrocities throughout history. Um, and so when we look back at the history of, like, World War II and the Holocaust, or the KKK, or segregation and Jim Crow, maybe less so with that one, but women's contributions to this time period are not talked about as much. And so by erasing women from our discussions, we've also kind of memory hold this idea that women can be really salient in horrible violent movements. And so I think that is kind of one of the reasons why when we think about extremist movements of the past, we think about the contributions of men. But of course, it's important to also add that, like, the far right is male supremacist. So as much as women do play a role, it's still, like, driven by men. Um, and so I think kind of because of that, we also assume, as I did naively when I started this book, that, like, well, why would women join a movement that hates them? Um, and that's kind of like what I tried to set out to answer in Pink Pilled.
And I think you did a great job of that.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So another question from the audience. How can we best work to counter, women's radicalization across borders? You're from the UK, I'm from the US. There's obviously some contextual differences between, the two of us. But what do you think the international community can do to, work with one another and help each other combat this issue?
Yeah, that also is a really great and interesting question. I've been getting a lot in the events I've been doing around the UK, asking, like, what can we do to combat radicalization of women. But this is the first time I've been asked about, like, an international aspect of it. So that's really interesting. I think, like, learning from each other and learning from what our movements do well in each country is really, really important. But also, like, learning the ways in which the far right in different contexts, like, what do they capitalize on? Because often, what is becoming a culture war or a point of discussion in the US kind of trickles down through the rest of the world, unfortunately. Um, and so I think us in the UK, to be a bit selfish, we can look at you guys and see kind of what's being talked about in the US. And so what do we need to, like, prepare for and start thinking about?
Yeah.
Um, but also learn a lot from you as well. I think, like, a strategy that I love that we can't really do as much here in the UK is I saw, like, often or in some places when Proud Boys or extremist groups were out marching, um, high school brass bands from America would go and, like, march behind them and, like, drown them out with noise. And I
Yeah.
thought that was, like, such a fun and amazing tactic and, like, type of direct action. We don't really have high school bands here, so we can't do that. But,
Mhm.
like, we could look at that and think, like, how can we get local musicians and people to, like, want to get involved in this.
Hmm.
So I think just like learning from each other is a great way to start, and I think also uh, yeah, just like understanding that this isn't just an American problem. If I can give some feedback, like populism and the far right is rising so rapidly in Europe, and so there's like so much discussion right now about what's happening in America. Um, but it would be great if like people in America also thought about like this is happening in Europe, maybe to similar degrees, and how can we be involved and like learn from each other. Um, so I think just kind of working transnationally is really important.
Yeah. So what effect would the disengagement of women and female supporters have on the far right movement? So if they just left, what would happen?
I
I
love
know
that
I
you,
don't want to, make you be a, fortune teller or anything. But in your best educated guess.
yeah. But again, this is a great question and one that I've not had yet from any of these events. So thank you. Obviously, we have a super engaged audience. Um, I think one of the impacts it would have would be, again, a lot of the like reproductive labor, and by that I mean like the labor needed to keep the movement going would crumble. Who is going to do the dishes after the meeting if there are no women? As women are often like put into that role. I think also it would be harder to spread these ideas as effectively. Like I said, women have played a really crucial part in like propagandizing for these movements. Um, like the trad wife trend and its like explosion into the mainstream has really helped to like bring a lot of these conversations into the more mainstream. Like when I was working at a women's magazine while writing this book, when I started working there, no one was talking about trad wives. A lot of people like hadn't heard of the manosphere or things like that. Um, and it was through kind of like the trad wife trend that a lot of people who were not so interested in politics or women who weren't so interested in politics started hearing about it. Um, so I think if all women were to collectively like leave the far right, it would have a really big impact on their ability to spread their ideas. Um, but I would love for that to happen. I hope it does.
As I'm sure all of us here would as well. Um, so another question that we have from the audience, are we prepared for the next evolution of female extremism, or are we still playing catch up?
Oh, we're still playing for catch up for sure. Sorry to answer that so quickly and without much nuance. But yeah, I don't, maybe I'll regret saying this. I don't think we're about to see a spate of like terrorism from women, but I do think we are probably going to see an increase in like women helping to facilitate violence.
Hmm.
Um, One of the examples I give in the book is kind of women as um, creating scripted violence. So, scripted violence is this term from Chip Bartlett, which is this idea that, like, you don't say someone should go out and kill these people. You say, like, these people are dangerous and deserve to be killed. And then someone in your following or your community goes and does that. And kind of how culpable are you for that happening? Um, I think like Libs of TikTok, which of course is like ran by a woman, is a good example of that.
Yeah,
So I think we are not prepared to deal with the role that women are playing in scripted violence. Um, and I do think we might see an uptick in women and in young girls committing some direct acts of violence as well.
yeah. All right. So in the interest of time, I will only pose one more audience question before we wrap up the event. Um, so how do these movements sell oppression as empowerment, and why does that work?
Another really great question, one I've not had yet. This has been a really interesting Q&A. I think the concept of aggrieved entitlement is really important here. Um, when we are talking about women in the far right, we're overwhelmingly talking about white cisgender women. And so one of the things I try and stress in the book is that for a lot of these women, they are aligning with their whiteness at the expense of their gender, at the expense of their womanhood. So in a way, they're kind of willing to tolerate some oppression on the basis of gender in
Hmm.
order to kind of fight for power that they feel they're being denied as white people. Um, and the far right, there's such like a white victim complex at the heart of it, in that white people are like painting themselves as the actual oppressed minority in society. Um, and so, in a way, empowerment is sold as oppression in some ways. But I think oppression is also sold as empowerment, kind of through this idea that like women have been tricked into a false empowerment, a false kind of economic empowerment, um, at the hands of like liberal or mainstream feminists. And it's like this real false dichotomy that's set up for them when perhaps like discussions around wages for housework, which we're seeing a lot more discussions of in the UK right now, um, might be more, productive than turning to tradwifery. Um, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think you did answer that just fine. Um, yeah, so with that being our last question, I would like to first of all thank Lois for showing up today and, agreeing to do this book talk and talk about her really important work that was done in this book and throughout the rest of, her writing and her journalism. So Lois, thank you for coming on, and we appreciate you taking the time to participate today. I would also like to thank our audience for attending as well and taking time out of your day to join us for this discussion. As always, this event is recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. So in case you missed it, feel free to check out our replay on our YouTube channel. And with that, we'd like to say thank you, and we will see you next time.